One of our scriptures for this week is found in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 22 to 31. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, God made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God, and perhaps grope for God and find God, though indeed God is not far from each one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are God's offspring. And since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, or an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now God commands all people everywhere to repent, because God has fixed a day on which God will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom God has appointed, and of this God has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." I love how Paul begins this speech to the Athenians. "I see how extremely religious you are in every way." And then he goes on to talk about all their idols and tries to get them to see how their focus isn't in the right place. But an ingenious start to capture their attention. As if to say, if we're judging by idol worship, then you people are very religious. And I got to wondering if someone might say the same thing to us at times. Maybe especially at a time like this. The writer of the blog, Deb Takes Her Life Back, has a really interesting post about modern-day idols. She says that anything we love, treasure, prioritize, identify with, or look to for need fulfillment outside of God has the potential to become an idol in our hearts or our lives. I like this definition, and I think it meshes with what Paul was trying to convey in Athens. That God cannot and should not be contained in gold or silver or stone or in the limits of our own imaginations and renderings. And when we try to contain God, there will always be things that come out of the container and begin to rise above God, that begin to take on a life of their own, stealing our focus and attention. When I think about modern-day idols and the world we live in now, I see examples all over the place. I see people idolizing money and security above all else. I see people idolizing their rights and freedoms. I see people idolizing their fear. I see people idolizing other people, the ones that they look to out of desperation to fix things or explain things, or idolizing data that upholds their own viewpoint. I see people idolizing their deepest desires and their longing to return to normal. And just so you don't think I'm pointing my finger, I admit to doing some of these probably before lunch today. None of these things is bad in itself, but every one of them is dangerous if it becomes an idol, if we look to it to fulfill some need that we don't believe God can fill. Paul reminds us that it is in God that we live and move and have our being. There is nothing outside of God. There is no container great enough and no need for any container from which our idols escape and begin to take over our lives. It is in God that we have our truest freedom, in God where we find our deepest peace. Paul tells his audience, while God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now God commands all people to repent. Those are powerful words. They could be used harshly, of course, but I'm always struck by how God's commandments, those to love God and love one another as ourselves, are actually invitations from the God who overlooks and forgives human ignorance, who understands and loves us without condition, who offers to us this opportunity to let go of the idols that we cling to like security blankets. Imagine what could happen if we did. Thinking of idols reminded me of the famous Charlie Brown Christmas special. Linus is known for dragging around his blue blanket, even as he's teased and ridiculed for doing it. He could just never give up that blanket. It was his security. But when he begins his speech about what Christmas is really all about, he tells the story of Jesus' birth from the Gospel of Luke. And in an unprecedented moment, as Linus speaks the words, "Fear not," he lets go of his blanket. Security is not found in any of our idols. Control over life's events does not come with trying to stuff God into a container of our making. When we let go, we discover what true freedom is all about. And we're able to live those commandments to love God and each other in the way God must dream for us. So if you've been running low on peace or contentment or patience, join me in examining our idols, naming them, and mustering up the courage to let them go, finding the freedom to live and move and have our being in God.